Now we're going to talk about everybody's favorite thing to pay, taxes. We're going to talk about who pays taxes. Now, on paper, whoever the IRS says is paying a tax is going to pay the tax. But in reality, when you put a tax in place, you're going to change someone's behavior. And by changing behavior, they're going to pass on some of the cost of a tax, some of the burden of a tax. We're going to talk here about our tax incidence, or the manner in which the cost of a tax is shared, or the burden of a tax is shared. What we're going to see is it doesn't matter who you levy the tax on or who you're officially taxing, whether it's the buyer, the seller, the employee, or the employer. That's not going to determine our tax incidence. What's going to determine it? Well, I'll give you the punchline here now. It's going to be the relative elasticities of our curves. Whichever curve is less elastic, that side is going to end up bearing more of the burden of the tax. Whichever side is more elastic, that side is going to end up bearing less of the burden of a tax. Why? Well, here elasticity is describing our behavior as prices change. Taxes change prices. Whichever curve is less elastic, they're going to be less responsive to that change in price. They're going to pay more of the taxes. Whichever curve is more elastic, they're going to be more responsive to a change in price. And you can think of it as they're going to try to avoid that tax. They're going to bear less of the tax burden. So here we're about to take a look at two scenarios. We're going to levy a tax on the seller at first. We're going to levy a tax on the buyer then. We're going to keep the elasticities constant. And as far as tax incidents go, you're going to see there is no difference. It doesn't matter which side you levy the tax on. So first here, let's take a look at a dollar tax implemented on our seller. I don't know what market this is. Maybe it's the donut market. We're going to tax the seller $1 for every donut that they sell. Now they say when you tax something, you get less of it. So I don't know why you would tax donuts. That seems kind of evil to me. I didn't know before I moved to Texas. Texas is big into donuts. They're big into barbecue, but they're also big into donuts. There's a lot of donut shops out there, and that makes me happy. But we're going to levy a tax here on our seller, $1 tax. Now, when you do that, it's basically like raising the seller or the firm's input costs. And what do we know when we increase input costs? Well, that supply curve is going to shift to the left. That's our change in behavior. Now, the size of the tax is seen vertically. So here it's $1 tax. Everywhere between our two supply curves vertically, that's where you see the size of the tax, $1. Of course, we shift up and to the left. To the left is going to be the change in quantity. Straight up and down, that's the change in price. So when you're talking about dollars, you're looking vertically. So the size of the tax vertically is $1 between our two supply curves. Now, the exact numbers I'm going to use here for the quantity that you're going to see, you cannot figure that out from the slopes. Don't torture yourself. These numbers are just arbitrary. I just picked them. Students in my class sometimes ask that, hey, I'm trying to figure out this math and I can't do it. You can't do it using the slope, so don't worry about it. It's the intuition that we want to pull out of this. But we're going to levy $1 tax on the seller. We change their behavior. The supply curve shifts to the left. They're going to pass on some of the burden of the tax in the form of higher prices to the buyer. We're going to see the price the buyer pays goes up. They were paying $5 before, now they're paying $5.60. We're going to go from our new equilibrium straight down to find the price the seller receives. So we go straight down where we hit our old supply curve. We're going to go across to our vertical axis. That is the price the seller receives. So they paid $5, or they received $5 before, now they receive $4.60. The difference between the price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives represents our taxes, right? Those are our taxes. So why do I say it that way? Well, I'm paying homage to one of my favorite basketball players of all time, Allen Iverson. I'm from the Philadelphia area. I love the Sixers. So I'm just paying a little homage to Allen Iverson and the way he talked about practice one day. He's kind of famous for saying that. So I walk across campus now and people yell at me. So I put it in my slides. So here, the difference between the price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives, that's our tax wedge. Now, at equilibrium, before the tax, there was no wedge. The price the buyer paid equaled the price the seller received. It was both $5. But now we've put a wedge between the two of them. That is the size of our tax. Now our tax incidence. Who bears what burden of the tax? Here we're going to see the buyer actually bears 60 cents of the dollar tax, the difference between what they pay now and what they paid before. The seller is only bearing 40 cents of this dollar tax, the difference between the price they received before and the price they receive now. So it doesn't matter who you levy the tax on. That doesn't determine the tax incidence. What determines the tax incidence is the relative elasticity of the curve. So here it must be that the demand curve is less elastic than the supply curve because the buyer is bearing more of the burden of the tax, even though we actually levied the tax on the seller. So this is our tax incidence looking at the tax levied on the seller. Now I'm going to show you the tax levied on the buyer. And you're going to see if I assume the elasticities stay the same, well, there's going to be no change in my tax incidence. So here, we're going to levy a dollar tax on the buyer. That's going to change the buyer's behavior. It's going to shift that demand curve to the left. When you change their behavior, they pass on some of the cost of the tax to the seller in the form of lower prices. Well, the size of the tax is seen vertically once again, now just everywhere between my two demand curves. We go from our new equilibrium straight up to our old demand curve, and we go across, we find the price the buyer pays, $5.60. So here we levied the tax on the buyer, but they passed on some of the burden of the tax. The tax burden is going to be shared. Here we see once again, the buyer is going to bear 60 cents of the dollar tax. The seller is going to bear 40 cents of the dollar tax because I assume that the elasticities have not changed. It doesn't matter who you levy the tax on. That doesn't determine our tax incidence. It just determines which side starts this whole process. It just decides which of the two curves supply or demand shifts to start this whole thing. The difference between the price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives, of course, represents our taxes. All right? Our taxes. So as I said, it's the relative elasticities of the curves that determines our tax incidence. So now I'm going to really exaggerate it for you, okay? I'm going to draw that demand curve in really steep, really inelastic, or the demand curve is less elastic than the supply curve here. I am not going to show which side we're levying the tax on because I just showed you that doesn't matter for the tax incidence. Whether supply shifts to the left or demand shifts to the left to start this whole thing, that doesn't matter to the tax incidence. So I'm leaving that off for the sake of cleanliness in our graph here. But what you see when that demand curve is relatively less elastic, any tax that you're going to put in place, more of that tax is going to fall on the buyer, is going to fall above the equilibrium price as opposed to below the equilibrium price. Again, why is that the case? Because elasticity describes our behavior as prices change. Taxes lower the price the seller receives and raises the price the buyer pays. The more elastic your curve, the more responsive you are to that change in price, the more you're going to avoid that tax, the less of the tax you're going to pay. The less elastic the curve, the less you respond to that change in price, the more of that tax burden you're going to end up sharing. Now here in this graph, the way it works out, the change in the behavior was the same for both of them. We went from Q star to QT, right? Not QT, but QT, okay? So that is our quantity after the tax. But you'll see the change in price for the buyer was much bigger to induce that same size change in behavior as opposed to the seller. The seller, the difference between the equilibrium price and the price they receive now, the price the sellers receive, that difference is much smaller than the difference between the price the buyer pays now and the price they paid at equilibrium. So it took a much smaller change in price level for the seller to change their behavior the same as the buyer. But still, what it comes down here to is whichever curve is more elastic bears less of the tax burden because they're more responsive to that change in price. They're going to avoid that tax. We can switch it around and we can take a look at the seller. Now here it's all the same words, all the same things I was saying, but now here the seller is less responsive to that tax. Their curve is less elastic, so they're going to end up bearing more of the burden of the tax. This is in the goods market. We can do this exact same thing in the labor market if we want to. So here, looking at the labor market, what's different? Instead of having the price the buyer pays, we're going to see it's the wage that the firm pays. Instead of the price the seller receives, it's going to be the wage the workers receive. Now, the labor market is a little bit backward from the goods market. So in the goods market, it's the household that demands goods, and it's the firm that supplies goods. Here in the labor market, it's the firm that demands labor. The firm is the employer. It's the household that supplies the labor. The household, those are the employees. Now, instead of the price the buyer pays, we're going to see it's the wage the firm pays. Instead of the price the seller receives, it's the wage the workers receives. The wage the workers receive, sorry. So all the technicals, though, that we were talking about in the goods market, they still apply, right? Whichever side you levy the tax on, that's the curve that's going to shift, but you're going to share the burden of the tax, and the way that tax incidence comes out, it's going to depend upon the relative elasticities of the curves. Whichever curve is less elastic, they bear more of the tax burden. Whichever curve is more elastic, they bear less of the tax burden. So here, if we levy a tax on the employer, what we're going to see, we're going to change their behavior. Here it's a payroll tax. It's a wage tax on our workers. So if you levy a tax on the employer, you're going to change their behavior. When you change their behavior, demand shifts to the left. They're going to pass on some of the tax burden to the worker in the form of lower wages, the wage the workers receive. The size of the tax is still seen vertically here between our two demand curves, our labor demand curves. We go up straight up the size of the tax, we find the wage the firm pays. So they're sharing that tax burden. The tax incidence is split between the two. Whichever curve is more elastic is going to pay less of the burden or share less of the burden. Whichever curve is less elastic, they're going to bear more of the tax burden. And we can flip it around the other way. If you tax the employee, you tax their wages. Well, you're going to see for some workers, then it's less worth it to work. You're going to see the labor supply shift to the left. You change the workers' behavior. They pass on some of the tax in the form of higher wages that the firm has to pay. So wage firms pay go up. We go down straight, vertically, the size of the tax is seen vertically. Go back to our old supply curve, we find the wage the workers receive. And again, the tax incidence is based on the relative elasticities of the curves. So here we talked about governments and markets, or government policy and markets. We talked about price ceilings, we talked about price floors, and we talked about taxes. And we looked at how they interact with our supply and demand curve. A binding price ceiling only matters if it's below the equilibrium price. It creates a shortage as demand increases beyond supply. A price floor only matters, it's only binding if it's above our equilibrium. It creates a surplus as supply increases beyond demand. And then we looked at our tax incidence, or the manner in which the cost or burden of a tax is shared. And we saw it doesn't matter who you levy the tax on. That doesn't determine our tax incidence. What determines it is the relative elasticities of the curves.